restaurant like a gunshot, followed immediately by the sound of chairs scraping violently across polished floors. Three men in dark suits stormed through the entrance of Lombardi's, the kind of high-end Italian establishment where reservations took months and silence was golden. The lead man, built like a linebacker with a scar running down his left cheek, pointed directly at the booth in the back corner where Dante Russo sat calmly cutting into his osso buco. His voice boomed across the stunned dining room, drawing every eye, freezing every fork midway to every mouth. He screamed that Dante had crossed the wrong family, that the Morettas sent their regards, that tonight Dante's reign ended in blood and humiliation. The two men flanking him fanned out, hands reaching inside their jackets toward hidden weapons, their intentions crystal clear and absolutely deadly. And in that frozen moment of terror, as wealthy diners dropped their napkins and reached for their phones, as the maitre d' stumbled backward in shock, only one person moved with purpose. The waitress in the gray uniform, the one who'd been refilling water glasses with mechanical efficiency just seconds before, stepped directly into the path of destruction with eyes that had suddenly gone ice cold and calculating. Okay, hold up for just a second, because I need to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city because what this waitress does next is going to absolutely blow your mind. This story goes places you won't believe. And the twist in part 3? Nobody, and I mean nobody, sees it coming. Now let's get back to this absolute chaos. Dante Russo had been expecting trouble for weeks, had known the Morettas were planning retaliation for his expansion into their territory, but he hadn't expected them to be bold enough or stupid enough to come at him in public, in his own neighborhood, in a restaurant where half the patrons were connected to his organization in one way or another. The man in the blue suit with the face tattoos sitting at the bar was his cousin Marco. The two businessmen in the booth by the window were his top enforcers. The older gentleman reading the newspaper by the fireplace was his consigliere. Dante had been surrounded by protection, had felt secure enough to actually relax and enjoy his dinner. And now 3 Moretti soldiers were about to turn this place into a bloodbath. He'd started to reach for his own weapon, had begun calculating angles and exits, had accepted that this beautiful meal was about to become his last supper. But then the waitress had moved, had positioned herself between him and the attackers with a fluidity that spoke of training, serious training, the kind you didn't get from carrying plates and remembering drink orders. Her name was Riley Santos, and she'd been working at Lombardi's for exactly 6 weeks, ever since she'd blown into town with nothing but a duffel bag and a carefully constructed background story about needing a fresh start after a bad breakup in Boston. The owner had hired her on the spot because good waitresses were hard to find, and Riley had immediately proven herself capable, professional, and completely unremarkable. She showed up on time, remembered orders perfectly, smiled when appropriate, and blended into the background the way good service staff always do. Nobody had looked at her closely. Nobody had noticed the way she scanned rooms when she entered them, cataloging exits and potential threats. Nobody had seen the calluses on her hands that came from weapons training rather than domestic work. Nobody had recognized the faint scars on her forearms that spoke of close combat and dangerous missions. Riley had been invisible, exactly as she'd intended to be, just another working-class woman grinding through shifts to pay rent and survive. But invisibility was over now, because the lead Moretti soldier was pulling his gun and Dante Russo was about to die, and Riley's carefully maintained cover was worth exactly nothing compared to the instinct that had defined her entire adult life before she tried to walk away from it. She moved like liquid lightning, closing the distance between her position and the lead attacker in 3 steps that defied normal human speed. Her right hand shot out and trapped his gun hand before he could clear his jacket, her grip iron strong and positioned perfectly to control the weapon and the wrist behind it. Her left elbow drove into his solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. She twisted his arm with a practiced motion that looked effortless but required perfect leverage and timing, forcing him to his knees while his gun clattered to the floor. The entire sequence took maybe 2 seconds, happened so fast that the other two attackers were still processing the fact that she'd moved at all. Dante had frozen with his hand halfway to his shoulder holster, his brain trying to reconcile the image of a waitress who'd served him pasta fagioli an hour ago with the combat specialist who'd just disarmed a trained killer with moves that belonged in a most sad training facility. The second attacker recovered first, abandoning his original target to deal with this unexpected threat. He was younger than the first man, faster, with the lean build of someone who relied on speed rather than power. His gun was already out, already rising toward Riley's center mass, and at this range he couldn't possibly miss. But Riley had already committed to her next move, had assessed, and acted while his neurons were still firing. She used the first attacker's body as a pivot point, swinging him around like a human shield while simultaneously launching herself forward in a roll that took her under the second man's line of fire. The shot went wide, punching through the decorative wine rack behind the bar and sending bottles of Burlo cascading to the floor in a river of red that looked disturbingly like blood. Riley came up from her roll inside the shooter's guard, too close for guns to matter, and delivered a devastating combination that started with a palm strike to his nose and ended with a knee to his groin that dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. The third attacker had better instincts than his companions. Instead of committing to an attack against this demon waitress who was dismantling his team, he'd grabbed the nearest civilian, a middle-aged woman in pearls who'd been dining alone, and had his gun pressed against her temple before Riley could reach him. He was shouting now, telling everyone to back off, telling Riley specifically to get on the ground or he'd paint the walls with this woman's brains. The restaurant had erupted into chaos, diners scrambling for exits, staff members screaming, someone triggering the fire alarm that added its piercing shriek to the pandemonium. Dante's men were on their feet now, weapons drawn, creating a semicircle of firepower around the situation, but nobody could take a shot without risking the hostage. Riley had gone still, had raised her hands in apparent surrender, but Dante could see something in her eyes that made him believe this fight was far from over. She spoke for the first time since the attack began, her voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline that should have been flooding her system. She told the man he was making a mistake, that he could still walk out of here alive if he let the woman go, that his bosses hadn't paid him enough to die in this restaurant tonight. The man had laughed, a harsh, desperate sound that suggested he knew exactly how this was ending and had already accepted it. He'd started backing toward the door, dragging his hostage with him, his gun never wavering from her temple. Dante's men had parted to let him through because the alternative was watching an innocent woman die, and even in their world, there were lines most men didn't cross. Riley had tracked the man's movement with predatory focus, had waited for the exact right moment, the split second when his attention was divided between his hostage and the armed men surrounding him. When she moved, it was with the kind of speed that made her previous actions look sluggish by comparison. She'd snatched a butter knife from the nearest table and had thrown it in a single fluid motion, the blade spinning end over end across 15 feet of space to embed itself in the gunman's shoulder with enough force to make him flinch and loosen his grip on the hostage. That flinch had been all Riley needed. She'd closed the distance while the knife was still traveling, had separated the woman from her captor with a shoulder check that sent the civilian stumbling to safety, and had dislocated the gunman's elbow with a joint lock that left him screaming and weaponless on the floor. The entire sequence had taken maybe 4 seconds. For seconds to save a life and establish beyond any doubt that the waitress who'd been serving antipasto and tiramisu was actually something else entirely, something dangerous and trained, and absolutely not someone you wanted as an enemy. Dante had finally managed to stand, his oso buco forgotten, his carefully constructed dinner plans completely destroyed. His men had secured the 3 attackers, were zip-tying their hands and confiscating weapons with efficient brutality. The hostage woman was crying and being comforted by the maitre d'. The restaurant was destroyed, tables overturned, wine soaking into expensive carpet, the fire alarm still screaming its warning. And Riley Santos was standing in the middle of all, breathing hard now, her gray uniform torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood running down her forearm from where she'd scraped it during the roll, looking like some kind of avenging angel who'd temporarily misplaced her wings. Dante's cousin Marco had approached Riley first, had started to say something that probably involved questions and gratitude, but Dante had waved him off with a sharp gesture. This conversation belonged to Dante himself because this woman had just saved his life using skills that raised about 1,000 questions about who she really was and what she was really doing working in his neighborhood restaurant. Riley had met Dante's gaze directly, had shown no fear despite being surrounded by armed men who worked for someone she'd just saved but didn't actually know. She'd waited for him to speak first, had given him that respect despite having just proven she was probably the most dangerous person in the room. Dante had studied her for a long moment, taking in the professional stance, the controlled breathing, the way her eyes never stopped scanning for additional threats even though the immediate danger had passed. He'd asked her a simple question that carried enormous weight. He'd asked who she really was, because waitresses didn't move like special forces operators, didn't throw knives with that kind of accuracy, didn't disarm multiple attackers like they were swatting flies. Riley had hesitated, had clearly been weighing how much truth to share, and Dante had seen the calculation happening behind her eyes. Riley had made her decision in that heartbeat of silence, had recognized that her cover was burned beyond repair and that lying to a man like Dante Russo would be both pointless and potentially fatal. She told him her real name was Riley Santos, but the background story about Boston and bad breakups was fiction. Told him she'd spent 8 years with a government agency that didn't officially exist doing work that never made the news. Told him she'd walked away 6 months ago because she'd seen too much death and carried too many ghosts and needed to find out if she could be a normal person living a normal life. Dante had absorbed this information with the kind of calm that came from years of processing shocking revelations without showing weakness, had nodded slowly, and had told her they needed to talk somewhere more private because the police would be arriving soon, and there were conversations that shouldn't happen in front of badges and body cameras. Riley had glanced toward the exit, had clearly considered making a run for it, disappearing into the night the way she'd probably done 12 times in 12 different cities. But something had kept her rooted in place. Maybe curiosity about this man whose life she'd just saved, maybe exhaustion from running and hiding and pretending to be someone she wasn't, maybe recognition that Dante Russo was looking at her not with suspicion or hostility, but with something that looked almost like understanding. The police had arrived in force, 6 cruisers and an ambulance, officers flooding into the restaurant with weapons drawn and confusion written across their faces. The scene had looked like a war zone, 3 men zip-tied and groaning on the floor, furniture destroyed, that wine still spreading across the carpet like an accusation. But Dante had handled it with the ease of someone who'd dealt with law enforcement 1,000 times, had explained to the responding sergeant that these men had attempted to rob his dinner party, that his private security had subdued them, that he'd be happy to provide statements and security footage and whatever else the investigation required. The sergeant had looked skeptical because everyone in this neighborhood knew who Dante Russo was and what he represented. But the story had been technically plausible and backed by 12 witnesses who'd suddenly developed remarkably consistent memories about what they'd seen. Riley had been introduced as a waitress who'd acted bravely to protect a customer, had been praised by the sergeant for her quick thinking, and had been told she'd probably be getting a commendation from the mayor's office. She'd accepted the praise with a modest smile, while Dante had watched her perform this civilian routine with the same skill she'd used to dismantle the attackers. 2 hours later, after the police had finally cleared the scene and towed away the would-be assassins and taken statement from everyone present, Dante had invited Riley to join him at his private social club 3 blocks away. She'd changed out of her ruined uniform into street clothes she kept in her locker, jeans, and a black t-shirt that somehow made her look even more dangerous now that everyone knew what she was capable of. Dante's men had formed a protective convoy, 3 cars moving through the late-night streets with the precision of a military operation, and Riley had ridden in Dante's vehicle while Marco drove, and another soldier rode shotgun. The silence during that drive had been heavy with unasked questions and unmade decisions. Riley had stared out the window at the passing streetlights while Dante had made phone calls in rapid Italian, coordinating responses and issuing orders with the authority of someone who ran an empire. The social club had been a revelation. Not the dingy mob hangout Riley had expected, but an elegant townhouse with art on the walls and leather furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. Dante had led her to a private office on the second floor, had poured them both scotch from a crystal decanter, and had settled into a chair across from her with the air of someone conducting a job interview rather than an interrogation. He told her he had questions, but she wasn't obligated to answer them, that she'd saved his life and earned his gratitude regardless of what came next, but that he was curious about the woman who could move like she'd moved and fight like she'd fought. Riley had taken a sip of scotch that probably cost more than her monthly rent and had started talking, really talking, for the first time in months. She told him about her recruitment at 22 fresh out of the military, about the missions in countries whose names she still couldn't speak, about the people she'd saved and the people she'd killed, and the slow erosion of her sense of self that came from living in shadows and lies. She'd explained that she'd finally broken after a mission in Syria had gone wrong and her entire team had been killed except for her, that she'd spent 3 months in debriefing and psychological evaluation before the agency had reluctantly accepted her resignation and made her sign documents that threatened federal prison if she ever spoke about her service. Dante had listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face, processing information with the same intensity he probably brought to business negotiations and territorial disputes. When she'd finished, he'd asked her why she'd chosen to work at Lombardi's specifically, whether it had been random chance or something more calculated. Riley had admitted it hadn't been random, that she'd been looking for a quiet place to disappear and had chosen this neighborhood specifically because she'd known it was controlled by organized crime, had figured that criminals tended to mind their own business and wouldn't ask too many questions about a new waitress who kept her head down. The irony of seeking safety in a mob neighborhood hadn't been lost on her, but it had seemed smarter than some suburban restaurant where soccer moms would want to know her whole life story and set her up with their nephews. Dante had actually smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his face from dangerous to almost warm, and had told her that her instincts had been solid even if the execution had gotten complicated when she decided to save his life instead of letting nature take its course. He'd asked her the obvious question then, why she'd intervened at all, why she hadn't just ducked behind the bar and let whatever was going to happen play out without her involvement. Riley had struggled to articulate an answer that made sense even to herself. She told him that she'd spent 8 years being told when to act and when to stand down, following orders even when they contradicted her instincts, watching bad things happen because the mission parameters said intervention wasn't authorized. She'd walked away from that life specifically because she wanted autonomy, wanted to make her own choices about right and wrong. And when those 3 men had stormed into that restaurant intending murder, something inside her had simply refused to be a bystander. Maybe it was muscle memory, maybe it was her conscience, maybe it was just who she was underneath all the attempts to be normal and invisible. Whatever the reason, she hadn't been able to watch Dante die when she had the skills to prevent it, even knowing that intervention would destroy her cover and potentially put her in danger from both law enforcement and criminal organizations. Dante had studied her for a long moment before telling her something that clearly cost him to admit. He'd said he understood that impulse, that need to act when your code demanded it even when the smart play was in action. He told her about his own daughter, about how she'd been killed 3 years ago in a drive-by shooting meant for him, about how he'd been sitting right next to her in the car when the bullets came through the window, and how he'd been powerless to protect her. He'd said that every day since then he'd lived with the knowledge that his choices and his life had stolen his child's future, and that he'd give everything he owned to go back to that moment and trade places with her. Riley had felt something shift in her chest, some recognition of shared trauma and understood loss. She told Dante about her team in Syria, about how she'd survived when better soldiers had died, about the survivor's guilt that ate at her in quiet moments and made sleep nearly impossible. They'd sat there in that elegant office, sharing war stories like veterans at a reunion, finding unexpected common ground in their respective damage. The conversation had stretched past midnight, past 1 in the morning, becoming the kind of raw, honest exchange that only happens when two people recognize each other as fellow travelers through darkness. Dante had eventually gotten around to the practical questions, asking Riley what her plans were now that her cover was blown and half his organization knew she was something more than a waitress. She'd admitted she didn't know, that she'd been planning to leave town anyway because 6 weeks was about as long as she ever stayed anywhere, that she'd probably head west or maybe north into Canada, where she could disappear into some small town and try this whole normal life experiment again. Dante had listened and then had made an offer that surprised them both. He'd told her he needed someone like her, someone with her skills and training, someone who understood violence but wasn't corrupted by it, someone who could make split-second decisions under pressure and wouldn't fold when things got bloody. He'd said he was trying to legitimize his operations, trying to transition from the old ways to something more sustainable. But that transition was making him vulnerable to people like the Morettas who saw his evolution as weakness. He needed protection that was smart and adaptable, needed someone who could think tactically and act decisively. And Riley had just proven she could do both. Riley's first instinct had been to refuse, to tell Dante that she'd walked away from violence specifically to avoid more killing, that working for a crime boss was the opposite of the quiet, normal life she'd been seeking. But even as she'd prepared to decline, she'd recognized something that made her hesitate. She'd been trying for 6 months to be a regular person with a regular job, and it had been slowly suffocating her, like wearing clothes that didn't fit and pretending they were comfortable. The truth was that waitressing bored her to tears, that she missed the adrenaline and the stakes and the feeling of using skills she'd spent years developing. She'd walked away from government work because of the moral compromises and the bureaucratic nightmares, not because she'd stopped believing in protecting people who needed protection. Working for Dante would be morally gray at best, would put her back in the world of violence and risk she tried to escape, but would also give her agency and autonomy and the ability to make her own choices about when and how to act. Plus, she'd admitted to herself with reluctant honesty, she'd actually enjoyed the fight in the restaurant, had felt more alive in those 30 seconds of combat than she'd felt in 6 months of smiling and serving pasta. She'd told Dante she needed time to think about it, needed to process the offer without the adrenaline of the evening clouding her judgment. He'd accepted that easily, had told her to take a few days, and had offered her a guest room in the townhouse rather than sending her back to her apartment where she might not be safe if the Morettas decided to retaliate by targeting the woman who'd embarrassed their soldiers. Riley had accepted the offer because her operational training said never refuse safe shelter when you just made enemies, and because some part of her was curious about what Dante's world actually looked like beyond the violence and territory disputes. She'd been shown to a room that was surprisingly tasteful, no Vegas mob aesthetic, just clean lines and comfortable furniture and a bathroom that was bigger than her entire studio apartment. She'd locked the door, had wedged a chair under the handle out of habit, and had stood in the shower for 30 minutes letting the hot water wash away the blood and wine and adrenaline residue while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Riley had barely slept that night, her mind too active and her instincts too sharp to fully relax, even in Dante's secure townhouse. She'd done what she always did in unfamiliar territory, had mentally cataloged every exit and weapon option in the room, had listened to the sounds of the building settling and the occasional footsteps of Dante's men doing security rotations. Around 4 a.m, she'd given up on sleep entirely and had done an hour of bodyweight exercises to burn off the restless energy, push-ups and planks and shadow boxing in the narrow space between the bed and the window. Dawn had found her showered and dressed, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her go-bag beside her, the duffel that contained everything she actually owned in the world fitting into one canvas bag that could be grabbed in 30 seconds flat. She'd been contemplating whether to slip out before anyone woke up, to disappear the way she disappeared from a dozen other situations when things got complicated, when a soft knock on the door had announced that Dante was already awake and wanted to talk over breakfast. The kitchen had been surprisingly domestic, Dante standing at the stove in a t-shirt and expensive lounge pants making eggs and espresso with the practiced ease of someone who actually enjoyed cooking. He gestured for Riley to sit at the small table and had served her food without preamble or ceremony. Just scrambled eggs with herbs and perfectly crispy bacon and bread that was still warm from a bakery run one of his men must have made at dawn. They'd eaten in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Dante had told her something that changed the entire context of his offer from the night before. He'd explained that the attempt on his life at Lombardi's hadn't been random mob violence or territorial posturing, that the Morettis had been hired by someone else, someone with resources and connections that suggested this went deeper than street-level organized crime. He'd been investigating for weeks, following money trails and intercepting communications, and what he'd found suggested that someone in law enforcement or government was trying to eliminate him specifically because of his efforts to legitimize his operations and cooperate with federal investigations into political corruption. Riley had set down her fork, her operational instincts immediately engaged by this new information. She'd asked the obvious questions about who and why and what evidence existed, and Dante had laid out a conspiracy that sounded paranoid except for the documentation he'd pulled from a folder on the counter. There were financial records showing payments from shell companies connected to a state senator who is currently under investigation for accepting bribes from construction companies. There were intercepted text messages suggesting that Dante's willingness to testify about municipal corruption in exchange for immunity was making powerful people very nervous. There were surveillance photos showing the senator's chief of staff meeting with known mob figures, including the Moretti family leadership. The picture that emerged was of a coordinated effort to eliminate Dante before he could provide testimony that would bring down not just the senator, but potentially dozens of connected officials and business leaders who'd been profiting from the corruption pipeline for decades. Riley had felt something cold and familiar settle in her gut. The recognition that she was looking at exactly the kind of institutional rot she'd spent years fighting overseas, only to discover it existed just as thoroughly in her own country. She'd asked Dante why he was showing her this, why he was trusting someone he'd known for less than 12 hours with information that could get them both killed. Dante had looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and had told her that he'd spent 3 years trying to build something better than the life his father had left him, that his daughter's death had shown him that the old ways only led to more graves and more grieving fathers, and that he was willing to risk everything to break the cycle, even if it meant trusting a former government operator who could disappear or betray him at any moment. He'd said he was choosing to believe that Riley had intervened last night, not because of some strategic calculation, but because she genuinely couldn't watch murder happen when she had the power to prevent it, and that kind of moral core was exactly what he needed on his side. The offer had crystallized into something much bigger than personal protection or tactical consultation. Dante had laid out a plan that was audacious and probably suicidal, but undeniably compelling. He wanted Riley to help him navigate the next 3 weeks leading up to his scheduled testimony before a federal grand jury. Wanted her skills not just for physical security, but for counter-surveillance and threat assessment, and the kind of operational planning that would keep him alive long enough to actually make it to that courthouse. In exchange, he'd pay her more money than she'd made in 2 years with the agency, would provide her with resources and support, and would guarantee that when this was over she'd have enough cash to disappear anywhere in the world and start fresh with a legitimate identity and no one looking for her. It was a mercenary arrangement wrapped in a cause that actually mattered, and Riley had recognized it as the closest thing to her old work she was likely to find outside of government service. She'd accepted the offer before her rational brain could talk her out of it, had shaken Dante's hand across the kitchen table, while some part of her screamed that she was making a terrible mistake and another part sang with relief at having purpose again. They'd spent the rest of that morning planning, Riley falling into operational mode, like putting on comfortable old clothes, assessing Dante's current security protocols, and identifying approximately 17 different vulnerabilities that made her professionally horrified. His men were loyal and tough, but they thought like street soldiers rather than trained operators, were positioned for show rather than actual defensive coverage, and were using communication methods that could be intercepted by anyone with basic surveillance equipment. Riley had started issuing recommendations with the authority of someone who'd planned protective details for diplomats in active war zones, and Dante's men had bristled at taking orders from some waitress who'd wandered in off the street, until Dante had made it crystal clear that Riley's word carried his full backing, and anyone who had a problem with that could find new employment immediately. The next 72 hours had been a crash course in transforming a mob operation into something approaching professional security. Riley had drilled Dante's men on proper positioning and communication protocols, had personally vetted every person who had access to Dante's regular locations, had implemented rotation schedules and counter-surveillance routes that made it much harder for anyone to establish patterns. She'd moved Dante out of his regular residence into a series of safe houses that rotated every 48 hours, had limited his movements to only essential meetings, and had personally tested every vehicle for tracking devices and explosives before allowing Dante anywhere near it. The men had gone from skeptical to grudgingly impressed to genuinely respectful as they'd watched Riley operate with a level of professional competence that most of them had only seen in movies. Marco in particular had become an ally, had recognized that Riley's presence was the difference between his cousin surviving the next 3 weeks and Dante ending up in a hole somewhere while his enemies celebrated. The first real test had come on day 4 when Riley's counter-surveillance detected a tail on their convoy as they moved between safe houses. She'd identified the vehicle immediately, a nondescript sedan with dealer plates that screamed either law enforcement or professional contractors, and had made the call to alter their route and execute an evasion protocol that left their tail stuck at a traffic light, while Dante's vehicle disappeared into a parking garage and switched to a backup car. The sedan had been persistent, though, had somehow picked them up again 15 minutes later, and Riley had recognized that they were dealing with someone good, someone with resources and training. She'd made the tactical decision to flip the script, to stop running and start hunting, and had directed their convoy into an industrial area where she could control the terrain and force a confrontation on her terms. The sedan had followed them into the maze of warehouses and loading docks, clearly confident in their ability to maintain surveillance, and had driven straight into Riley's trap. She'd positioned Dante's vehicles to create a kill box, had put riflemen on 2 different rooftops with overlapping fields of fire, and had waited until the sedan was committed to the dead-end street before blocking their exit with a delivery truck that materialized from a side alley. The sedan had screeched to a stop, had tried to reverse, and had found their retreat blocked by another of Dante's vehicles. Riley had approached on foot with Marco covering her, had yanked open the driver's door with her weapon drawn, and had found herself looking at 2 very surprised private investigators who'd been hired to follow Dante and document his movements. They'd claimed they were working for a law firm conducting due diligence for a business acquisition, but Riley had known immediately they were lying, had recognized the subtle tells and the quality of their equipment that suggested they were actually working for someone with serious money and serious intentions. She'd made a split-second decision that defined her approach to this entire operation. Instead of threatening the investigators or trying to intimidate them into revealing who'd hired them, she'd offered them triple their current contract rate to feed false information to their employers and provide Riley with advance warning of any planned moves against Dante. The investigators had been surprised by the offer, had clearly expected violence or at least serious threats, but had recognized a good business opportunity when they saw one. They'd agreed after some negotiation and the transfer of a substantial cash deposit, had provided Riley with contact information for their handler, and had become unwitting double agents in a game they didn't fully understand. Riley had let them go with explicit instructions about what kind of intelligence she expected and what would happen if they betrayed the arrangement, and had watched them drive away, while Marco had looked at her like she'd just performed magic. Back at the safe house, Dante had been both impressed and concerned by Riley's tactical innovation. He'd praised her creativity, but had questioned whether they could trust investigators who'd already proven willing to work against him. Riley had explained that she didn't trust them at all, that she'd given them sanitized information and would be verifying everything they reported through independent channels, but that having them feeding false positives to whoever had hired them would buy time and create confusion among their enemies. It was basic counterintelligence, using your opponent's own surveillance apparatus against them, and it would work until it didn't, at which point Riley would already have moved on to the next layer of protection. Dante had asked her where she'd learned to think like this, to see patterns and possibilities that his street-smart soldiers missed, and Riley had told him about operations in hostile territory where one wrong move meant not just mission failure but international incidents and dead civilians. You learn to think creatively when the stakes were that high. Learn to turn every disadvantage into a potential asset. Learn that the best defense was usually a calculated offense that kept your enemies reacting instead of planning. The revelation about the investigators had opened up a new avenue of investigation into who exactly was coordinating the attempts on Dante's life. Riley had traced the payments back through 3 shell companies before hitting a wall that suggested professional money laundering, but she'd found enough breadcrumbs to confirm that this was bigger than mob rivalry or street-level retaliation. Someone with access to law enforcement databases and government resources was coordinating the surveillance and planning the attacks, and that someone had deep enough pockets to hire both mob soldiers and private investigators. The senator's name kept appearing in the periphery of Riley's investigation, always just far enough removed to maintain plausible deniability, but close enough to suggest coordination. Riley had explained to Dante that they were dealing with what she'd call a protected target in her old work, someone with enough institutional connections that direct action would trigger massive blowback and legal consequences. The only way to win against someone like that was to make them expose themselves, to create a situation where their own desperation forced them into making moves that could be documented and used as evidence. Riley had proposed a strategy that made Dante's entire team nervous, but that she insisted was the only way to force their enemies into the open. She wanted to fake a vulnerability, to make it appear that Dante's security had a catastrophic hole that could be exploited, and then document whoever took the bait when they attempted what they thought would be an easy assassination. It was a classic intelligence operation, creating false opportunity and watching who moved to capitalize on it. But it required Dante to essentially paint a target on himself and trust that Riley's planning was good enough to keep him alive when the trap sprung. Dante had listened to the full proposal, had asked pointed questions about contingencies and failure modes, and had ultimately agreed because he recognized that playing defense for 3 weeks was a losing strategy when his enemies had infinite opportunities to probe for weaknesses. They needed to flip the dynamic, needed to move from reactive to proactive, and that meant taking calculated risks that his soldiers would never have suggested because their entire training focused on keeping their boss safe, rather than using him as bait. The operation had taken 5 days to set up properly. Riley coordinating with contact from her old life, who owed her favors and were willing to provide equipment and technical support without asking too many questions. She'd leaked information through the turned investigators suggesting that Dante would be meeting with his lawyer at a specific office building downtown, and made sure the leak included details about limited security presence and a narrow window of time when he'd be vulnerable. Then she'd spent 3 days turning that office building into a carefully monitored kill zone, installing cameras and sensors and positioning her own shooters in locations that would give her complete coverage of any approach vector. Dante's actual lawyer had been moved to a different location entirely, replaced by an undercover detective who owed Dante a favor from years ago and was willing to bend some rules to help take down a corrupt senator. Riley had briefed everyone multiple times on their roles, had established communication protocols and abort signals, and had personally walked every inch of the operational area looking for variables she might have missed. The day of the operation had dawned gray and cold, the kind of weather that matched Riley's mood as she'd positioned herself in an overwatch spot 3 buildings away with a clear view of the lawyer's office entrance. Dante had been in the motorcade approaching the building, wearing a Kevlar vest under his suit and looking remarkably calm for someone who was deliberately making himself a target. Riley had watched through her scope as the vehicles had pulled up, as Dante had stepped out with just Marco accompanying him, as they'd walked toward the entrance with the kind of casual confidence that suggested no special security precautions. Her radio had been alive with reports from her various positions, everyone confirming their readiness and waiting for the threat to materialize. Riley had felt the familiar focus settle over her, The way time seemed to slow and her senses sharpened, the operational mindset that had kept her alive through 100 dangerous situations. The attack had come from two directions simultaneously, suggesting more sophisticated planning than the restaurant assault. A delivery van had screeched to a stop at the curb while two shooters on a nearby rooftop had opened fire, the combination designed to pin down the target and prevent escape. But Riley had anticipated exactly this kind of coordinated assault, had positioned her own people to counter both threats, and had given the order to engage the moment the first shot rang out. Her rifle had barked twice, dropping one rooftop shooter while her spotter had taken the second. And the tactical team she'd positioned near the delivery van had swarmed it before the doors even fully opened. The entire firefight had lasted maybe 20 seconds, ending with 3 dead attackers and 2 captured alive, and Dante hustling into the building unharmed while police sirens had begun wailing in the distance. Riley had felt the adrenaline singing through her veins, had experienced that savage satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly, and had immediately shifted to extraction mode because standing around celebrating was how you got killed by backup teams you hadn't anticipated. The captured attackers had been the breakthrough Riley needed, because unlike the mob soldiers from the restaurant, these men had been professionals, hired contractors with military backgrounds who kept detailed records of their contracts and payments. Under interrogation by Dante's people, with Riley supervising to ensure things didn't go too far, one of them had cracked and provided access to encrypted communications that laid out the entire conspiracy. The senator hadn't been directly ordering hits. He'd been smart enough to maintain plausible deniability, but his chief of staff had been coordinating everything through intermediaries and shell companies. The communications included detailed discussions about eliminating Dante before his grand jury testimony, about making it look like mob violence rather than political assassination, about the millions of dollars in construction contracts and municipal corruption that would be exposed if Dante survived to testify. It was everything the FBI would need to not only protect Dante, but to expand their investigation into a much larger case involving dozens of public officials and business leaders. Riley had packaged the evidence professionally, had created multiple encrypted copies and distributed them to journalists and law enforcement contacts who couldn't all be compromised, and had essentially ensured that even if Dante died, the conspiracy would still be exposed. It was insurance and leverage combined, making Dante more valuable alive than dead, because killing him would just trigger the release of information that his enemies desperately wanted to suppress. The strategy had worked brilliantly. The senator had suddenly resigned, citing health issues. His chief of staff had been arrested by federal agents, and the entire house of cards had begun collapsing as people scrambled to cut deals and minimize their own exposure. Dante had been moved to federal protection pending his testimony, which was now expanding to cover not just municipal corruption, but a multi-state conspiracy involving millions in misappropriated public funds. The safe house where they'd celebrated that victory had been filled with Dante's men drinking expensive wine and toasting Riley like she was some kind of warrior goddess who descended from the heavens to save their boss. Marco had made a speech about how he doubted her at first, had thought she was just some government spook trying to infiltrate their organization, but that she'd proven herself 100 times over and earned her place in their family. Riley had accepted the praise uncomfortably, had never been good at being the center of attention, and had slipped outside to the small balcony where she could breathe and process everything that had happened. Dante had found her there 20 minutes later, had brought her a glass of wine, and had stood beside her looking out at the city lights without speaking for a long moment. When he'd finally broken the silence, it had been to thank her not just for saving his life, but for giving him hope that maybe the system could actually work, that maybe bad people could face consequences, that maybe his daughter's death hadn't been completely meaningless if it had set him on a path towards something better than the life he'd been born into. Riley had felt tears prick her eyes because she understood exactly what he meant, understood that need to find meaning in tragedy and purpose in survival. She told him that working with him had reminded her why she'd joined the agency in the first place, before the bureaucracy and moral compromises had worn her down, when she'd still believed that one person with the right skills and the right intentions could actually make a difference. Dante had asked her what came next for her, whether she'd stick around or disappear now that the immediate crisis was over, and Riley had admitted she didn't know. The money he'd paid her was enough to set her up anywhere, to build that quiet, normal life she'd been chasing, but she discovered something important over these intense weeks. She didn't actually want quiet or normal. She wanted purpose and stakes, and the chance to use her skills for something that mattered. Dante had made her an offer then that surprised her with its generosity and trust. He'd told her he was building something new, a security consulting firm that would be completely legitimate, working with companies and individuals who needed protection from both criminal and institutional threats. He wanted Riley to run it, to build it from the ground up using her expertise and contacts, to create something that gave people like them a place to belong and a way to do good work without having to compromise their principles or work for governments and agencies that might betray them. It would be her operation, her rules, her team, and he'd provide the financial backing and connections while she provided the vision and leadership. Riley had looked at him standing there in the city lights, offering her not just a job, but a purpose and a future, and she'd realized that maybe she'd been running from the wrong thing. She hadn't needed to escape violence and danger and high-stakes work. She needed to escape the powerlessness and moral compromise of working for people who didn't share her values. Working for herself, with Dante as a partner rather than a boss, that was something different entirely. She'd accepted his offer with a handshake and a smile that felt genuine for the first time in months, and they'd started planning the new venture right there on that balcony, while the celebration continued inside. The federal testimony had gone smoothly 3 days later, Dante spending 6 hours in front of the grand jury, laying out everything he knew about corruption pipelines and municipal fraud. The indictments that had followed had been spectacular, taking down not just the senator, but 3 state representatives, 2 judges, a dozen business leaders, and numerous mob figures who'd been part of the conspiracy. The media had called it the biggest corruption bust in state history, and Dante had become an unlikely hero in the press, the mob boss who turned state's evidence and helped clean up the system. The irony hadn't been lost on anyone, least of all Dante himself, but he'd handled the attention with dignity and had used his platform to talk about breaking cycles of violence and building better futures. Riley had stayed in the background during all of this, had avoided media attention and kept her name out of official reports, but she'd been working tirelessly to build the security firm that would become her new life. She'd recruited carefully from her old contacts, bringing in people who were skilled and principled and tired of working for organizations that didn't value either quality. She'd established protocols and standards that were military-grade professional, creating something that was simultaneously a business and a calling. The first clients had been referrals from Dante, business owners and executives who needed protection from threats both legal and illegal, and Riley had handled each case with the same intensity she'd brought to protecting Dante. The firm had grown quickly, building a reputation for excellence and discretion, and Riley had found herself leading a team of 20 operators within 6 months and turning away clients because they couldn't keep up with demand. A year after that night at Lombardi's when 3 men had attacked a Mafia boss and changed everything, Riley had been standing in her office looking at a map of their active operations when Dante had called with interesting news. The restaurant had been completely renovated and was reopening with new management, and Dante wanted Riley to be there for the grand opening as his honored guest. She'd driven to Lombardi's on a beautiful spring evening, had walked through doors that had been replaced and into a dining room that had been completely transformed, and it felt strange seeing the space where her life had pivoted so dramatically, looking so fresh and normal. Dante had been waiting at the same corner booth where he'd been sitting that fateful night, and he'd stood to greet her with genuine warmth and affection. They'd shared a meal and talked about their respective successes and the strange journey that had brought them from that violent confrontation to this peaceful celebration, and Riley had realized she was happy, genuinely content, for the first time since leaving the agency. The evening had ended with Dante presenting her with a small velvet box, and Riley had opened it to find a simple silver pendant shaped like a shield. He'd told her it was a reminder that some people were born to protect others, that it was a calling rather than just a career, and that he was grateful every day that she'd chosen to answer that calling when it had mattered most. Riley had put on the pendant and had worn it every day since, a private symbol of the moment her life had found its purpose again, and she'd stopped running from who she actually was. Sometimes your greatest strength emerges in your darkest moment, when instinct overrides fear and training meets opportunity in a split second that changes everything. Riley had tried to walk away from violence and danger, had believed that normal life was what she needed, but she discovered that purpose matters more than peace, and that using your gifts to protect others is its own reward. The courage to act when others freeze, the wisdom to recognize when running toward danger serves a greater good, and the strength to build something meaningful from chaos. These are the qualities that transform ordinary people into extraordinary protectors. Drop a comment about what you do in Riley's position. Share this with someone who needs inspiration. The next story will blow your mind even more. You won't